Hi, my name is Michael Biggs, and this presentation addresses the conference topics of interdisciplinarity, philosophy in the arts, and visual culture. So what does interdisciplinarity mean in this context? Well, the first reading is that it exists between two existing monodisciplines, so knowledge that is to be found by investigating the gaps between disciplinary boundaries. The second reading is that it occurs when methods from one discipline are taken over into another, where they are not usually applied. In both these circumstances, new knowledge can be found. And this kind of interdisciplinarity is encouraged by the research councils, as one can see from specific strategies to encourage it from the European Research Council, from the NSF in the United States, and all sorts of national funding bodies such as the FWO in Brussels for Belgian researchers. So what do we want to draw attention to in these circumstances? Well, it's the emergence of new knowledge and therefore the need for new terminology and new concepts to accompany that research, or as an outcome of that research. Interdisciplinarity always exists in this state of emergence, because one of its characteristics is that it can give rise to new disciplines. So something that is interdisciplinary in the boundary between two existing forms of knowledge emerges and becomes a mature discipline in due time. Then perhaps we no longer regard it as interdisciplinary and it moves off to become an established monodiscipline. And here we bump into the idea of Whorfianism. Whorf is known for connecting what can be said in a particular language with the cultural concepts that he thought were influenced and constrained by that language. Whorf's followers developed a concept of strong Whorfianism, which was that there was actually a direct connection between what can be said and what can be thought. And depending on the language context in which one finds oneself, so one's thought patterns are constrained by that language. Now we want to compare that to the emergence of technical vocabulary and new concepts in emerging disciplines, such as in the interdisciplinary context. And so we are comparing the problem of Whorfianism, the problem that one may not be able to conceive of things for which one does not have language, with the emergence in research of new concepts where one is seeking to identify something for which one has not yet got technical language. Now, of course, this version, called strong Whorfianism, is not widely held, and so we're not actually depending on that reading of Whorfianism. We prefer the weak thesis, which is that there is an influence between these things, an influence between, in particular, what can be said, what can be written, and what can then be thought. And it only requires this weak thesis to allow us to speculate that there need to be specific strategies in interdisciplinary research to facilitate thinking across boundaries, and in particular to overcome the limits of technical language. Something I'd like to point out at this point is that there is not an exact synchronicity between what can be written and what can be said. There exists in language things that we can say that we don't write down, and things we can write down that we don't say. In the former, there's much in conversation, gesture, facial expression, emphasis, these things that escape the way we normally write down speech. So, for the purposes of conversation analysis, an additional annotation scheme needs to be developed to capture some of these paralinguistic effects that are not normally captured in writing. So to that extent, we say that there exists things that can be spoken that are not normally, at least without special notation, written down. Then, of course, on the other hand, it's quite clear that there are lots of things that can be written down that we can't say. We can write music, for example, we can draw pictures. All of these things cannot be directly put into words. So to introduce a second authority in this, a second reference, by expressing it as the limits of our language, this invites comparison with the philosopher Wittgenstein, in whose later work expressly focused on the impact of the limits of language on how we think and how we philosophize. So we were interested in how did Wittgenstein overcome or deal with this problem of the inexpressibility of what lies beyond language, if there is such a thing. And so we looked at his manuscripts to see how he annotated his thoughts whilst he was investigating the limits of language. So the first thing to note about Wittgenstein's manuscripts is that there are a great many additional forms of notation extra to what you would expect in simply writing down in German or in English, or indeed in Spanish, any natural language, what might be spoken. So taken very literally, it is actually not possible to read Wittgenstein's manuscripts aloud because not everything that's in them can be converted into speech. Now you might expect that if the manuscripts were full of diagrams and so on, but they're full of additional forms of notation, and it's the purpose of this additional notation to push at the limits of language. So the key point is that when we see Wittgenstein working at the limits of language in his manuscripts, it's quite often that we see him extending the notational vocabulary by innovating or by stressing existing forms of notation in order to make it expressive, often to push it into an area where it becomes meaningless, where we could say, okay, this now doesn't mean what we think it is, and invites an alternative reading, something outside of the box. Wittgenstein calls this thinking outside the box the dawning of an aspect. And when we can't see something, he calls it aspect blindness. Going back to the initial proposition, our claim is that monodisciplines, owing to their restricted technical vocabulary, present the potential problem that they make us aspect blind because we don't have the vocabulary for the emerging concepts coming out of our interdisciplinary research. Using graphical means or using by extending and distorting existing notation in creative ways, as Wittgenstein did, we can release ourselves from that. We can allow the dawning of an aspect, the realization that it could be different. That we could count on our hand 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or just as well 1, 2, 3, 4. They are both just as present in the hand. So this is the kind of thought experiment that Wittgenstein invites us to undertake, not so that we doubt existing arithmetic, but so that our preconceptions are challenged, so that we are open to the dawning of a new aspect. And the claim of this paper is that this is greatly facilitated by altering our notational conventions, so that we are not stuck in existing ways of annotating and thinking about things, and we are liberated, usually through graphical means, to think about things in alternative ways. So we are not made aspect blind by our notation, but we are allowed to, the aspect is allowed to dawn, a new aspect is allowed to dawn. So the outcome of our research in this paper is to propose that interdisciplinary projects should address this explicitly, that such projects should include a person with graphical and data representation expertise, and that there should be a work package in which this is explicitly addressed to ensure that the way the interdisciplinary research is recorded and annotated facilitates the dawning of the new aspects that is the benefit of interdisciplinary research according to the European Research Council, the NSF, and the other funding bodies that are promoting it. Thank you.